World War II continues. Lecture terms. Because Hitler and Mussolini had prepared for war earlier than the Allied powers, they were able to take over great amounts of territory right after the war was declared in early September of 1939. We discussed in the last lecture how Hitler was trying to take advantage of the time he had, knowing it would take a while for Great Britain and France to mobilize. In the meantime, he was able to take over not only Poland, but also most all of Scandinavia, and then he started to move into Belgium, and then he moved down and actually took over France as well, inoculating them as a threat. He will occupy France, and France will be in German hands for the duration of the war, for the most part, until June of 1944 with the D-Day invasion, which we will discuss on a later slide. So, by the middle of 1940, it seemed as if Hitler and Mussolini were going to be able to take over most all of Europe. We, however, need to note that Japan was also doing the same thing in Asia as the war started. They were taking over territory throughout the Pacific Rim, and we will talk more specifically about their actions there in later slides as well. So by the middle of 1940, it seemed as if the only worry that Germany and Italy had left, of course, was Great Britain. Great Britain was all alone in its fight against the Axis powers. The Soviet Union had their own deal with Hitler at this point, the Non-Aggression Pact. The United States was once again maintaining their neutrality, declaring splendid isolationism, and Great Britain was alone. So it seemed as if it would be very easy for Hitler to just move in and overwhelm Great Britain, since they were not as ready for war as he was to begin with. But that will not prove the case. Ultimately, this is what happens. The Battle of Britain, which begins in the fall of 1940, was the attempt of Hitler to invade England to force them to capitulate. And knowing that England was an island country, Hitler knew that an amphibious invasion would eventually be necessary. Great Britain was still known to have one of the best navies in the world, and Hitler recognized this and knew that it would not be easy to invade by sea. So he wanted to soften up the target before attempting the amphibious invasion. So he began the Battle of Britain in the fall of 1940 as an air war conducted by the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, sort of utilizing some of the same tactics he did with Blitzkrieg. He sends the Air Force over Great Britain first to try to bomb them into submission. And this is known as the Blitz, this air war conducted over Great Britain by the Luftwaffe. The primary targets initially in the fall of 1940 were the Royal Air Force bases throughout Great Britain. If they could knock them out and they could destroy most of the British planes, they knew that they would be able to move in and take over through that amphibious invasion. The Royal Air Force, however, was able to prevent the Germans from invading. They were able to get their planes in the air before those targets were bombed, because they were able to see the Germans coming without the Germans even knowing it. The British had a new technology that they had borrowed from the United States as a trading partner. Even though we were still technically neutral in the war, they had borrowed the technology of radar from the Americans. They had learned this technology, and they were able to see when the German planes were coming. Ultimately, they were able to launch counterattacks against the Luftwaffe and make it very difficult for the Germans to launch a full-scale invasion. Ultimately, in the Blitz, it was a very costly victory for the British, meaning that they were able to fend off the Germans. But about 40,000 British civilians were killed in the process. After it seemed as if the Royal Air Force bases were not going to be sufficient to bomb to force the British to surrender, the Germans began bombing urban centers, especially London, to try to attack the civilian population and force the government to capitulate to save their people. But they were not able to force the British to surrender. Instead, by December of 1940, Hitler had to rethink what he was going to do. He knew that an invasion of Great Britain was not going to be possible, and he would have to put that on the back burner to continue his rapid movement. He could not get bogged down in the Battle of Britain. Knowing that he would have to do something about them sooner or later, though, he decided to take a different approach. He needed to keep moving. So, because of his lack of resources, he had to keep moving. And so he decided that he would turn his attention to Eastern Europe. And what he would ultimately end up doing is violating the non-aggression pact he had with Russia and invade it instead. Hitler believed he needed as much territory as possible for the growth of the Aryan race. Lebensraum, living space, was necessary. He could not allow himself to get bogged down in one place for too long because of the lack of resources. And that's one of the reasons why he abandoned the Battle of Britain efforts by early 1941 and instead decided to plan a massive invasion in Eastern Europe, which would ultimately bring him into Russia. By June 22, 1941, Hitler officially violates the non-aggression agreement that he had with Stalin, and he invaded Russia, aka the Soviet Union. This ultimately, he thought he would be able to take over this territory and all of the agriculturally rich fields he could use to his advantage to feed the ever-growing Aryan race and take the supplies, including petroleum and other things, that he could utilize for his war effort. And he thought he would be able to take over Russia in a matter of months before the Russian winter set in. However, what ends up happening is the winter comes early in Russia, and ultimately the German panzer units, the tanks, get bogged down in many of the places that they were located in Russia, especially in the northern parts, as well as in the far southern parts. They were able to push towards Moscow in the middle, but they got bogged down on the edges in the north and in the south. And so ultimately, this winter, just like we saw when Napoleon tried to invade Russia, the winter proves to be one of the best weapons of the Soviet forces, of the Russian forces. Now, Stalin was caught off guard initially with this attack, since he had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. But this shows you how totalitarian leaders are opportunists, if nothing else. The non-aggression pact no longer served the purposes that Hitler wanted it to serve, and so he decided to violate that pact and invade because he wanted the resources that the Soviet Union had more than he wanted to try to keep that peace with Stalin. And so ultimately the severe winter sets in and the German troops get bogged down. The long supply lines weakened the German efforts. The blitzkrieg tactics do not work in Russia, especially once the winter sets in. And this ultimately, by the end of 1941, Hitler recognizes the mistake that he has made, although he would never admit that it was a mistake. He is now forced to fight a two-front war. The Soviet Union will join the Allied cause with Great Britain, and ultimately the Soviets were able to launch a counterattack by the spring of 1942. Ultimately, we will see this two-front war, and this will change everything. And by the end of 1941, we have quite a different war than we did at the beginning of 1941. Not only will we see the entrance of the Soviet Union on the side of the Allied powers, but we will also see the entrance of the United States into the war officially by the end of 1941. With the failure to invade Russia, Hitler now has to change his approach and force his attempt to create Lebensraum for the Aryan race by turning inwardly. Hitler's new order will be the instrument that he uses to do this. And this is where we see the genocide, the attempted genocide of the Jewish population of the world attempted. Ultimately, the Nazis encouraged Jewish immigration earlier on, prior to the new order being launched. Before the war began, as we talked about before, they boycotted Jewish businesses. They eventually launched pogroms against the Jews, attacking Jewish businesses and homes and synagogues through things like Kristallnacht. But few countries were willing to accept the Jewish refugees that did leave Germany. Many Jews did not want to leave Germany because, of course, Germany was their home and had been their home in their families for many, many generations. It was very difficult for that to happen. They, instead, the Nazis decided that they would try to concentrate the Jews into certain areas of German-occupied Europe. Initially, they, of course, had deported them into ghettos in certain German-held territories throughout Europe, but eventually they will load many of the Jews up on train cars and force them eastward into Poland, where they had built a number of work camps. These concentration camps initially were work camps, where the Jews would be the forced labor for the Nazis. Eventually, however, and this was by the spring of 1942 that they began this process. Eventually, however, these camps will be transferred into death camps. Once the Nazis lose the offensive position, especially by the beginning of 1943, many of the camps that had been work camps will be converted into death camps. And the Nazis will utilize a lot of their new technology that they had developed to build their new war machine, including some different kinds of poisonous gas. They will use these to help them, have technologically advanced murder through poison gas. Zyklon B was one of the gases that was used on the Jews. Many of the Jews would be loaded into showers, massive showers, which they would be loaded into these big rooms thinking they were going to be given a shower, and instead of water coming out of the shower heads, the poisonous gas did. Once all of the Jews were dead in that room, they would then have to do something with the bodies. Large crematoria were created to try to destroy the bodies that were left, the corpses that were left. The estimated number of Jews killed in this, what will be known as the Holocaust, is about 5.7 million Jews, roughly 25% of the world's Jewish population at the time. Of that 5.7 million, about 40% of them were under the age of 12. About 5 million others besides the Jews were also fell prey to the Holocaust: gypsies, disabled, homosexuals, intellectuals. But ultimately, because of the Holocaust being so costly for the Jews, after the war is over, the United Nations will decide that they need to create a homeland for the world's Jewish population, and the state of Israel will be born, if you will. We'll talk more about that in a later lecture. The entrance of the U.S. in World War II. Now, as I said before, the United States had declared themselves splendidly isolated once again prior to World War II's beginning. Just like before World War I, they tried to remain neutral. But before they did come into the war, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which we'll talk about in a moment, we do need to recognize that the United States, much like before World War I, even though they declared their neutrality, they did initiate a policy known as cash and carry that allowed for the United States to supply the Allies with armaments that they needed in order to fight against the Axis powers. They also established a Lend-Lease program where the United States lended war goods to the Allies and leased our own naval bases to the Allied powers so they could mobilize for their fight against the Axis. Both with cash and carry and the Lend-Lease programs, the United States, even though they are declaring themselves neutral, seems to be favoring the Allies. But they would not initiate, themselves to get involved in the fracas early on. Eventually, what will pull the United States into the war is the attempt of the Japanese to take over all of the Pacific Rim, which will eventually lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Earlier on, the United States had frozen Japanese assets within the United States, and the U.S. also placed an embargo on oil shipments to Japan. This caused the Japanese Defense Minister, Tojo, to start planning for a war with the United States. And this will eventually culminate in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The United States President at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, will famously refer to this attack, this surprise attack on our naval base in Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy. The United States Navy in the Pacific was almost completely destroyed with this attack. Almost. Ultimately, what happens is this will guarantee that we will enter the war on the side of the Allies. And 4 days after the attack, Hitler and Mussolini also declare war on the United States. This will cause the United States to join with Great Britain and the Soviet Union officially as part of the Allied forces against the Axis. However, the United States will be forced to fight on two different fronts, one in the Pacific and one in Europe. This is what Hitler had wanted. Knowing that the United States would most likely end up in the war, he was hoping that if they did, they would have to fight on two fronts. And it is understood that Hitler and Mussolini perhaps might have helped encourage the Japanese to attack the U.S. first, hoping that if the U.S. came in, they would be focused more on what was going on in the Pacific, or at least would have to divide their forces between the Pacific and the European theaters. Now, in the Pacific theater, by early 1942, we see Japan had already come to dominate most of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. They had actually established an area known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which ultimately became known as the Japanese Pacific Empire. The United States had interest in the Pacific, especially in the Philippines, and the Philippines was invaded by the Japanese early on. And this will eventually be a problem for the United States. Once the Philippines were invaded, our foothold in the Pacific, especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, was damaged. And so we started to mobilize to challenge Japan. By 1942, there will be some shifts happening in the fight against Japan in the Pacific. Japan will eventually lose their offensive capability after 1942. And we'll talk more specifically about the battles that forced that to happen, in particular the Battle of Midway. We'll talk more about how 1942 will be a pivotal year in the war, which will shift the axis from having offensive capabilities to them being just on the defensive. And instead, the Allies will be able to take the offensive after those 1942 key battles are fought. And it will shift the tide of the war. There were some key Allied victories that will turn the tide against the Axis powers by the end of 1942, putting them on that defensive position where they lose their offensive capabilities. First, we're going to discuss what happens in the European theater, key Allied victories in the European theater starting in 1942, leading eventually to victory in Europe against the Germans and the Italians. Between 1942 and 1943, the British and U.S. forces that are fighting in the European theater against the Axis, in particular Germany and Italy, attack different strongholds of the Axis powers. First, they focus on North Africa. This was where the Italians had gained a foothold in El Alamein, and in 1942, the British forces launch an attack on El Alamein and take it from Italy. This naval base ultimately allows for the Allied powers to move into the Mediterranean region. The Mediterranean will be open to the Allies as a result, and this will allow for a combined U.S. and British force to move up the boot of Italy, the boot meaning the way Italy looks on a map. From the southern part of Italy, they will start to roll upwards towards northern Italy and eventually force Mussolini out. Mussolini's people, by the end of 1943, will have turned on him, and they actually are responsible for capturing him and hanging him themselves. So Italy will be pretty much inoculated as part of the Axis powers by the end of 1943, or at least by early 1944. This will leave other areas open for the Allies to have more victories. Now, on the Eastern European theater, there's also some movement going on by the late 1942 into early 1943. The Red Army of the Soviet Union will finally gain offensive capabilities by early 1943 with the Battle of Stalingrad. February 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad will result ultimately in a victory for the Red Army. They will be able to start to push the Nazis that had become entrenched in Russia out, and they will roll back the German panzer units and forces, pushing them out of Russian territory. And eventually the Russians will continue to push westward, moving into Poland, and many of the concentration camps will be liberated in the process. We will also see that with the combined push of the British and the Americans from the south moving into the Mediterranean, pushing northward from the Mediterranean, and the Russians pushing from the east, they're basically putting more and more pressure on the Germans and the Italians. Of course, the Italians will be pretty much out of it by the end of 1943, and trying to force the Nazis into a vice. Still, the Nazis would not back down. They would not surrender. And so eventually the United States and the British forces determined that they need to launch another attack to come from the west in Europe. And they start the process of planning a massive invasion of German-occupied France to liberate France, which was originally part of the Allied forces, to liberate France from German control. And this, of course, will be the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord. The D-Day invasion starting on June 6, 1944. Combined British and U.S. forces land in France on the beaches of Normandy, and from that foothold that they gain, they will start to roll back German occupation forces out of France, liberating France. Then they will move northward into Belgium, where they will continue to fight against the Germans. Eventually, after a last-ditch effort of a German offensive with the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, the Allied forces will be able to push the Germans out of Belgium, and now it would be a race to see who would get to Berlin first. Would it be the Red Army pushing from the east, or would it be the British and American forces pushing from the west? This race to Berlin. In the meantime, the United States and the British continue to air bomb German cities as they continue to push deeper into Germany. The Soviets, however, were the ones that reached Berlin first. By the end of April 1945, April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. A week later, May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrenders. And VE Day is declared, Victory in Europe. The war will continue in the Pacific, but the war in Europe was over. Now, I mentioned that turning the tide in the Pacific really begins in the middle of 1942 as well. Turning the tide against the Axis powers in 1942. This is one of those same examples. The Battle of Midway, June of 1942, was a key victory for the United States forces, the United States Navy, in the Pacific region. It allowed for the United States to gain a foothold in the Pacific region after having lost a huge part of our forces in Pearl Harbor, as well as losing the control over the Philippines. After the Battle of Midway, the United States will take the offensive, and we will engage in what was known as the island hopping strategy. One by one, taking island after island after island, rolling back Japanese influence there. The Japanese will lose their offensive capability and will just try to maintain the control over what they already had. But slowly but surely, between June of 1942, moving through 1943 into 1944, we see one island after another falls away from Japan, and the United States are able to take over. Many of these battles that were fought on these islands were extremely costly, however, and the costliness of these battles makes the United States wonder if they need to take a different approach to try to force the Japanese surrender. Especially after 1940, when 1945 rolls around and the European theater comes to an end. What are they going to do? Initially, the idea was that the United States would probably have to invade Japan itself. And that would, of course, force a lot of men to move from the European theater once it was over into the Pacific theater to launch this massive invasion of Japan. But there were some key battles in 1945 that made the United States determine that they might have to take a different approach. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were very, very brutal battles that did result in victories for the United States, but they were so costly, and the Japanese refusal to surrender made the Allies, and especially the United States, that was in charge of the efforts in the Pacific, made them wonder if they should not take a different approach. Instead of invading Japan, maybe they should use some new technology that they had that might force the Japanese to surrender without the United States having to invade. The United States had been developing a new weapon that they thought that they were going to use against the Germans. The Germans would end up surrendering and ending the war in Europe prior to the new weapon being ready. This, of course, was the atomic bomb. The United States, after firebombing Tokyo in March of 1945, where 100,000 were killed, including a great number of civilians. 25% of the buildings were destroyed, 100,000 killed. The Japanese still refused to surrender. It convinced the United States that a Japanese unconditional surrender would not happen easily, and that if they invaded Japan, it would be very costly. The Japanese seemed willing to fight until every last man was gone. And so these new weapons, these atomic bombs, it was determined that we would drop these new weapons on Japan to try to force a surrender, which we justified saying it would not only save American lives from that invasion, but ultimately it would save Japanese lives, as many from dying, hoping that the Japanese would surrender after the dropping of the bombs. The first of the atomic bombs was dropped in early August on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb will be dropped on Nagasaki. After these bombs were dropped, which were extremely costly, and there will be thousands upon thousands of casualties as a result of these bombs. Eventually, we also need to note that there would be more casualties later on because of radiation poisoning and cancers caused by that radiation. But this will finally force Emperor Hirohito to surrender unconditionally on September 2nd, 1945. We will discuss more the implications of this surrender, as well as the aftermath of World War II, and how it ultimately launches a new phase, a new kind of war called the Cold War between the Eastern world and the Western world as we move forward. We'll discuss those things in a later lecture. Thank you.